The title for this video is Are White People to Blame for Their Population Decline? It's basically an accompaniment to my last video, White Genocide, refuting the notion that white people are volunteering for their genocide somehow, or they deserve it in some way. I'm going to tackle this topic by reading a couple of comments that were made on my White Genocide video and then basically expanding on what they say. Right, so here's the first comment. Using the term white genocide to describe what's going on right now is a logical contradiction. A genocide can only happen when people are involuntarily being destroyed. Sick. Whites are volunteering for this because they are that stupid. These are grown-ass adults, not children. They have agency. They are choosing whether or not to drink the Kool-Aid. If they make the wrong choice, that's on them. When people pretend away agency and replace it with victimization, they become the new SJWs. White genocide is simply another flavor of SJW. Right, first of all, SJWs are liars. They lie about their victimization. They make things up so they can gain political power, they can have influence, financial benefit, and generally further their political agenda. So you can't compare every victim to people lying about their victimization. There are real victims and fake victims. Hence, SJWs are fake victims. So when an individual is genuinely being abused, we don't say to them that they deserve it because they're adults that have agency. There are other things to consider, like using fear as a means of control. And one way we can explain this is through psychological studies and methods like operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So you use positive and negative stimuli to gain a certain reaction from the people you are attempting to control. This is very much how sociopaths, narcissists, generally intraspecies predators behave. They try to condition you to respond the way they want, which is how they gain control. So with this in mind, what happens to white people that speak up about their displacement and replacement? Well, they're accused of racism, they're accused of a hate crime, and these things can lead to ostracization, and they can lead to financial disincentives. They can lead to financially crippling the individual. They could end up losing their home. They could end up struggling to feed their children. They could end up having all sorts of financial implications that will make them think twice about questioning or challenging a particular narrative. Now, I've already addressed the cultural propaganda and the pressure going on that makes people abandon and hate their identity. So when you combine this with the pressure that white people feel for not conforming to this idea that white people are the most evil in the world, it becomes easy to see why it's very difficult for white people to break out of that. So let's go on to the next comment. This has to be the stupidest video on YouTube. So who is to blame for your so-called white genocide? If your population isn't sustaining its own numbers by having a positive birth rate, is that the fault of other races? Blame yourselves. If there is any group that has systematically wiped out other races, it is the white race. The records and numbers are therefore a fact check. If you take all non-white people out of Western societies, those regions will cease to function in a few decades because the population will eventually implode due to negative birth rates. The white race has always needed others to do their dirty work. Go look into all the factories and workhouses in these countries. It is coloured people working their butts off to keep the economy going. So your idea of white genocide is bullshit. Let's assume it's true. Don't you think it could be the universe dishing out karma for all the sins of the past? Go figure. By the way, you aren't even white, so you shouldn't even be talking about this topic. Well, Greeks are white. If you don't think so, you're conforming to the Nazi idea that only the Aryans from the north are truly white, basically people with blonde hair and blue eyes. So yeah, well done for that one. So I'm sure you're probably somebody that wouldn't want to be elevating these ideas, but there you go, you just did. White people have done more good for humanity than any other race, which is another thing worth noting here. And yet, this is the thanks they get. A lot of ungrateful non-whites who think they're entitled to everything they have. I mean, who were the ones pivotal in ending slavery, for example? It was white people who had the worst slavery in trade in the world. It was the Ottomans, the Arabs, the Muslims. Are they ever criticized for slavery? Not at all. So by the logic of this commenter, when he brings up karma, this is an inversion of any idea of karma you can think of, where the most noble are treated as the worst. Now, even if you don't believe in karma in a spiritual sense, which I certainly don't, if you go around hurting people all the time, then the chances are eventually that's going to come back at you with other people wanting to take revenge. So even on that basis, you could say, oh, okay, there's some karma somewhere. But given all the good white people have done in the world, how they've done the most to advance humanity, I mean, there are some theories that say that around 95% of progress for humanity has come from white people, as well as the things they've done to advance human rights. And they're treated as the worst. So go figure. That just shows you how white people really need to start reconsidering the way they are always putting the needs of others before themselves. Now, let's talk about this birth rate idea that white people are basically going to destroy themselves if they don't have immigrants come into their countries to prop them up. To understand how nonsensical this is, we'll talk about RK selection theory. So with RK selection theory, a lot of people like to base it on in-group loyalty, but that's at the very least that's secondary, and in many ways it's irrelevant. RK selection theory is to do with the parenting strategy of a certain species or a certain group. So if you're R selected, you'll usually have lots of kids, lots of young, and then you will have a low parental investment strategy. A K-selected species, or a group or a race or whatever, they will have less children and have a high investment parenting strategy. Now, the reason why this is important is because most white people have less children when there are more resources. So they're more like wolves. They're more like wolves. They'll have smaller groups, and then basically they'll have a high investment parenting strategy. I mean, we could certainly say that white people don't have a very high in-group loyalty, but again, you can certainly see that white people have less children and they have a high investment parenting strategy. So this is why parenting strategy is at the heart of RK selection. Most other races on the planet have the opposite parental strategy. They're more like rabbits. They are selected. They'll have lots of children and they'll have a low investment parenting strategy. And now we can move on to Europe and the birth rate in this continent. Why do white people need to maintain current population levels in Europe? What's the reason for this? Because all that will happen is the population will decline and then stabilize at a lower level. Now, there are some people that seem to think that the white birth rate will just keep declining indefinitely until we're just wiped out. There's no evidence for that. I mean, pandas have a real problem with reproduction and they're at risk of being wiped out, but there's no evidence that that will happen to white people. There's something else going on here, and this is what I want to explain for the final part of this video. Now, the central banking system requires continuous inflation to pay off debt and prop up asset stock market bubbles. So this means that the population in Europe cannot be allowed to decline and stabilize at a lower level. Otherwise, the Ponzi or pyramid scheme will just collapse. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that asset prices, stock prices, housing prices will get lower. And this will make them more affordable for everybody, which will probably lead to a birth rate boom. a baby boom. People will be able to afford to have bigger families again. Maybe one parent will be able to stay at home, or both parents will be able to work part-time, or something along those lines. So why are people so worried about this? There's one big reason, and that's because the elites in the world are the first people that will lose. They stand to lose a lot. So they're the ones who are trying to make people paranoid and panic about the population rate in Europe going down, the population level. So globalists and leftists, these financial elites as well, are flooding white countries with our selected people through mass immigration. And they're displacing and replacing white people because we're more case selected and we will have less children when resources are abundant. When the population declines to a certain level, we might have more children at that point because resources might not be as abundant at that point, for example, because the economy will have suffered. So this is all about propping up this central banking system based on this fiat currency backed by nothing and, government debt that involves printing money and having interest attached to the printing of money. So you can never pay off your debt. It's impossible. So it's a Ponzi scheme in the literal sense of the word. So the solution by the elites is to keep the population growing, because actually it's not even about keeping the population stable. It's about, you've got to have the population continuously rise. So we can see this solution within a UN report at around the year 2000 called Replacement Migration. Is it a solution to declining and aging populations? So there you can clearly see that the solution in countries like Japan and continents like Europe is to import people from other countries to replace people in those countries, and which is absolutely ridiculous. It's genocide in the literal sense of the word. I mean, that's the evidence of it right there. This is also an ideological goal of one world government. So there are people that, for example, want one race, one religion, one government. And the key thing here is that white people were warned about overpopulation as part of the environmental side of this agenda. And then all of a sudden they're told that, oh no, the population is too low. We need to keep this sustained at a certain level. We need it to go up. And essentially that will lead to your replacement. This is all by design. So don't really have much more to say on this matter for now. Hopefully this has given people some food for thought and made people think again about the birth rate for white countries and have a more nuanced way of thinking about this, because it's not the end of the world if the white population goes down. Even if it's, several million, the important thing is that white people are able to maintain their culture in their nations. As long as that happens, white people will continue to exist. But when you've got our selected cultures coming into your country, they will replace you. And that's the problem. That's the key problem. And that's another reason why countries are important. As well as the fact that it's a good balance for power, for i.e. those that want to end up controlling the world. So, yeah, that's all I've got to say for now on this matter. No doubt I'll revisit it in the future. But for now, this is Rocking Mystery, over and out.